All right. Hello, everyone. We'll let more people come in and we'll begin right now. It's 1:33 and we'll start the meeting with the number of people we have at this time. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to the Alberta Energy Regulator's information session on brine-hosted minerals. This session is the first phase of our engagement approach for minerals. My name is Carol Stark, and I work with the Engagement and Communications branch at the AER and will be the moderator of today's session. I want to recognize all of you who have gathered in this virtual space from across the province and share with you who's here in the room. We have close to 330 people registered to attend, people who are representing the minerals industry, municipalities, Indigenous communities, landowners and land users, environmental and other non-government organizations, education and research institutions, and interested members of the public. Also in attendance to provide their support are staff from the Alberta Energy Regulator, the Alberta Geological Survey, and the Government of Alberta. At the AER, we acknowledge Alberta is in the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples of lands now covered by Treaties 6, 7, and 8. This includes the 8 Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. I will now pass you to Martin Foy, who is the AER's Chief Operations Officer, for his opening remarks.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Alberta Energy Regulator's information session for brine-hosted minerals. My name is Martin Foy and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the AER. As Carol described, we have more than 300 participants here, which is awesome to see. Thank you so much for all of you joining us for this special session. Mineral resource development is a key part of the government of Alberta plan to diversify our economy and in particular the energy and resource sector. This means that the AER's mandate is expanding to include the regulation of minerals and related elements that can be found across Alberta. But before we draft the tools to regulate mineral development, we want to hear from Albertans such as you. Therefore, a session like this is critical, both for information sharing and for information gathering. So thank you again for all of you participating today. I hope you find the next 2 hours both informative and an excellent opportunity to share your input. We have some great speakers lined up for you today from the Alberta Energy Regulator and from the Alberta Geological Survey. So let's get started. And with that, I'll hand you over to Carol. Carol Stark.
Thank you, Martin. I'll now give a quick overview of what to expect in today's session. As Martin said, and it's certainly worth repeating, this session is an opportunity for both information gathering and information sharing. Therefore, the agenda has 2 main parts: presentations to share information with you, which should take approximately 40 minutes, and an opportunity for you to ask questions about topics that are on your mind. And in the time we have, we should have around an hour plus to be able to work with you around questions. Following the opening remarks, the presentations will be delivered in these 4 sections: the mineral strategy implementation, the regulatory development process, the potential resource mineral development, and next steps, which will include further engagement opportunities. A couple of things to note. This entire meeting is being recorded, as was noted in the registration process. By registering, you have agreed to that recording. And the other thing to mention is that this slide presentation will be made available on the AER's website. The 3 main presenters for this information session are Shauna Cartwright, who is the Director of Minerals Strategy and Implementation at the AER, Cher Jacobs, who is a Senior Specialist in Regulatory Design at the AER, and Gloria Lopez, a Geologist in Minerals Resources at the Alberta Geological Survey. or the acronym which many of you may know, AGS. So for tips for participation in the meeting this afternoon, the agenda and background materials that you received following your registration contained information about ways to participate in the session. And since then, there has been a bit of a change in our approach. Due to the high level of interest in this session, which we fully appreciate and are quite thrilled by, we will not be able to receive, unfortunately, verbal questions. We will address your written questions in 3 ways, however. The first, we have asked for questions in advance to be read out, and I thank those of you who sent in questions to us. Secondly, we will use the Microsoft Teams Q&A function to receive your written questions for those of you who can access that function. And if you cannot access that, you can email us your questions to the address you see here, minerals@aer.ca. As you listen to the presentations, please make note of your questions and maybe even write them down on a piece of paper you have and hold them until the presentations are finished. And the reason for this is that your question may be adequately addressed in the information that is shared. And lastly, if you are having technical issues, please contact the AER inquiries line at the number you see or email to minerals@aer.ca. And you also have this address in your background materials if you have those handy. So now I'm very, very happy to pass it over to Shauna Cartwright to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Carol mentioned, I'm Shauna Cartwright, and I'm going to cover some preliminary information about minerals strategy implementation. This is the first time we've held a session like this, and we're hoping to engage a wide cross-section of stakeholders to make sure you have some information and can seek clarity before we undertake some workshops. So, why develop minerals in Alberta? Worldwide demand for metals and critical minerals is increasing rapidly. This is happening in response to technological advancement and the global shift towards a lower carbon economy. Alberta has favorable geology for many metallic and industrial minerals, and Gloria will speak more about some of these opportunities shortly. The government of Alberta wants to capitalize on Alberta's mineral potential and become a preferred international producer and supplier of minerals and mineral products. And Alberta has the necessary infrastructure in place to support a growing mineral sector. Renewing Alberta's Mineral Future is a Government of Alberta strategy and action plan. This document outlines a path to unlock Alberta's untapped mineral resource potential. This will help meet increasing demand while creating jobs and attracting investment. So, what's our part in all of this? What is the Alberta Energy Regulator's role? The Government of Alberta is expanding our mandate to include the regulation of metallic and industrial minerals. Once in force, the Mineral Resource Development Act will establish the AER as the life cycle regulator for Alberta's mineral resources. We are excited to be starting our work with Albertans to help inform future regulatory decisions. I want to mention that there is already mineral resource development occurring in Alberta, and current regulatory oversight is spread across several regulatory agencies. One gap in the existing framework is resource conservation and ensuring these minerals are not wasted. The AER has well-established processes for regulating energy resource development. As the future mineral life cycle regulator, the AER will be applying these processes and developing requirements that reflect the government's direction that is set through policies, regulation, and legislation. We will be looking at the existing regulatory processes within Alberta as well as other jurisdictions as we enhance the regulatory framework for minerals. As we work to build and implement a new regulatory framework for brine-hosted minerals, the AER's mandate is expanding and it involves new work. It would be inappropriate to use oil and gas levy funds to support this effort, and the AER has received a government grant to support this work for the current fiscal year. The AER's key deliverables will include new regulations, as well as directives and potentially manuals. We will need some way to accept applications and allow for reviews of mineral resource exploration and development applications. This is new work, and it will require training and development of our existing staff, as well as some recruiting to ensure we have the appropriate skill sets and expertise like we're known for in the energy sector. So, how did we get here? Mineral strategy implementation is a journey. It is a priority for the federal and provincial governments and the Alberta Energy Regulator. In 2020, the federal government updated its minerals and metals plan. And in November 2020, the government of Alberta announced their intent to develop emerging energy and mineral resources as part of their economic recovery efforts to relaunch and diversify Alberta's economy. Alberta Energy undertook stakeholder engagement late in 2020 and into 2021. On November 4th of 2021, the provincial government publicly released the Mineral Strategy and Action Plan, Renewing Alberta's Mineral Future, as mentioned on a previous slide. Also in late 2021, the government undertook further stakeholder engagement on Bill 82, the Mineral Resource Development Act. The Act was approved by Cabinet in early December, and once in force, it will align the AER's authority over minerals with other energy resources and helps enhance the fiscal and regulatory environment for metallic and industrial mineral development. The Mineral Resource Development Act also provides legislative authority to the AER to regulate mineral resources and ensure their safe, efficient, orderly, and responsible development. For 2022, the AER is focused on developing rules and directives for brine-hosted minerals and designing and developing business processes. We will also work on technology solutions required to accept mineral exploration or development applications. We will continue with our engagement efforts as our work progresses. The AER is aiming to be able to accept applications for brine-hosted mineral development projects in early 2023. We are undertaking a phased approach for minerals, and we will continue to work with stakeholders as we develop the framework for mineable minerals. Let's now discuss what these minerals can do. Some everyday uses of minerals. We've categorized minerals under the Mineral Resource Development Act into two groups, brine-hosted and hard rock minerals. We'll talk about brine-hosted minerals in a later slide. Conventional hard rock minerals refer to minerals extracted through more traditional mining or quarrying. There is hard rock mineral development occurring in Alberta today, and the existing quarries are regulated by Alberta Environment and Parks. Our process to develop regulatory tools to support the development of these minerals will be done in phases. Brine-hosted mineral engagement and the development of those requirements will occur first, and hard rock minerals will come later. Here on the screen, you can see examples of some of the products these minerals can produce. For example, critical and rare earth minerals can be found throughout Alberta and are used for making batteries, portable devices, TVs, toothpaste, buildings, eyeglasses, computers, vehicles, hospital equipment, and many other daily use items. Gloria will tell us more about these minerals a little later, but hopefully this gives you a general idea. The remainder of today's presentation will focus on brine-hosted minerals. Brines containing minerals are typically found in underground salt water and can be extracted through wells. The water targeted for mineral extraction is very saline and would not otherwise be useful for municipal or agricultural purposes. Once at surface, the minerals would be extracted using various technologies and processes, and the salty brine would then be returned to the subsurface. The photo on this slide is just for illustrative purposes and may be similar to what we might expect a brine-hosted mineral development to look like in the future. Before we talk about the regulatory development process, I should note that the new minerals policy is inclusive of all minerals, with the exception of coal, peat, marl, clay, ammonite, sand, and gravel, which are out of scope because they're regulated under other legislation. And the AER will continue to regulate petroleum, oil, asphalt, bituminous sands, oil sands, natural gas, and coal. As I mentioned previously, our approach for enhancing the minerals regulatory framework will be done in phases. And when we have a better understanding of the timing expectations for mineable minerals, we'll seek to undertake engagement. Now I'm going to hand this over to Cher to talk to you about the regulatory development process. Cher?
Thanks, Shauna. Next slide, please. I would like to unpack with you what we mean by regulatory development and regulatory frameworks. When we talk about a regulatory framework, we're talking about the acts, the regulations and rules, and the directives that outline the regulators' expectations of industry. The Government of Alberta is responsible for developing acts and regulations, and the AER develops rules and directives. At a really high level, acts outline what industry must do if they want to develop. So an act could say something like, an operator must secure an approval before drilling a well. Regulations and rules provide additional detail and interpretation of what's in the act. For example, a rule may say industry must submit an application with certain technical and environmental information to get an approval. And directives provide the specific requirements the industry must follow. So a directive might say industry must submit the location of a well and show that it's a certain distance away from an environmental feature before getting an approval. But this is just the first part of a regulatory framework. These requirements are augmented by processes to review applications thoroughly and efficiently, and processes to inspect and audit industry to make sure everyone meets its commitments. There are education programs to make sure everyone understands what requirements apply, and there are industry performance reports that make information about how resources are being developed available to the public. And there are systems to plan for project closures and enforcing that industry addresses its liabilities. It is through this complete regulatory framework that the AER ensures the safe, orderly, and environmentally responsible development of resources over their entire life cycle. And when we talk about regulatory development, we're talking about what we're doing right now. It's the steps we take when developing this kind of framework. It involves talking to stakeholders to understand what is important and to collect information. And it involves in identifying risks and understanding what tools we can use to mitigate these. In this sense, the AER can leverage its 83-year history regulating the energy industry and everything we've learned along the way to regulate an emerging mineral resource industry. So when we look at where we are today, we are in the process of developing the rules and the directives that will fall under the second part of the Mineral Resources Development Act, which is focused on developing brine-hosted minerals. And these steps are these sessions are our first step in engaging you to give you a sense of our process so you can engage more fully in our upcoming workshops. Oh, next slide. Let's talk about addressing risks with regulation. Mineral resource developments could have impacts on our environment and on our communities. And it's the AER's job to create and enforce requirements that ensure that people, wildlife, and the environment are protected. We also have to ensure that mineral resources are conserved so that Albertans receive the full benefit of resource recovery. So as part of that regulatory development process, we must examine the risks associated with developments at each stage, from construction to operation and at project closure. We start with different scenarios of how minerals could be developed. We looked at the wells used to pump brine to surface, then the pipelines that could transport brine to a facility, and so on. And using our experience from regulating oil and gas and pulling from stakeholders and subject matter experts, we're trying to identify what could go wrong. And systematically, we're moving through these scenarios to make sure we have the requirements in place that mitigate the risks and ways to make sure that industry is complying with these requirements. Requirements can restrict the type of activity or how an activity can occur. They can place thresholds or limits on certain activities. And often the AER requires industry to demonstrate how they will conduct activities safely and what plans they have in place in case of an emergency. Compliance in the form of inspections and audits are used to verify the companies operate within their approvals. We also monitor the financial health of operators to make sure that they can meet their end of project life obligations. But we don't stop considering risk once the requirements are developed. We continue to consider risk in our decision making. If a company submits an application for an activity that introduces uncertainty or higher risks, our technical experts take a closer look at it. This additional review could be triggered if applications involve new activities or technologies, there are known stakeholder concerns about this activity, or there are known attributes of the project, like its location or the operator's history, that make it potentially higher risk. The AR also uses a compliance assurance program to verify that companies operate within their approvals. This means we work with industry to make sure they know what to do to meet our requirements. We check in on them with audits and inspections to confirm that they are operating how they are supposed to. And if we find that they aren't, we take enforcement measures. We consider risk in these programs too. We look at an operator's history of complaints, releases and spills, emergencies, and overall operational history, as well as any factors such as how close projects are to people or environmental features when planning which projects to inspect and audit, and if certain sites should be inspected or audited more frequently. I will now turn it over to my counterpart on the Minerals Project, Gloria Lopez, who will talk you through the minerals resource potential in the province. Gloria?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Cher. I'm Gloria Lopez, a minerals geologist with the Alberta Geological Survey. So I'm going to talk to you about mineral potential in the province for mineral resource development. So the Alberta Geological Survey is responsible for the geology and resources in the province and for providing information and knowledge to inform resource opportunities, as well as land use, environmental impact, public health and safety issues related to geoscience. We conduct research in many areas of geology, including but not limited to mineral resources. In our work during our 100 years of existence has helped to map the geology of our province relevant for minerals and to identify the potential for mineral resource development. Our publications range from reports, maps, and data to interactive tools and applications freely available on our website. On this photo, you can see our geoscientists mapping a section of shale rock in northern Alberta. Let's look at the minerals map now. The minerals in Alberta. What you see here is the Minerals of Alberta map produced by the Alberta Geological Survey in 2020. This is a simplified view of the publication available on our website. It shows the location of current metallic and industrial mineral producers, as well as a selection of exploration projects. Metallic and industrial mineral commodities being produced in Alberta currently include limestone, dolomite, building stone, sandstone for silica sand, salt, calcium, and magnesium. Limestone, dolomite, and building stone and silica sand are extracted from quarries, whereas salt is solution mined from salt beds buried deep in the subsurface. Brines are extracted through wells for calcium chloride and magnesium from salty waters as old as 390 million years old. All the minerals currently being produced in the province are needed for industrial applications such as construction, drilling, road maintenance, and agriculture. The map also shows the areas with geological potential for the exploration of undiscovered resources. This potential occurs at different depths, some on surface and others in the subsurface. Although on this map they seem to overlap, they usually don't. Some of these potential areas include elements dissolved in brines, occurring deep in the subsurface. For example, lithium shown in purple and calcium shown in green. As you see, the province has potential for many minerals, such as uranium, diamonds, vanadium, which are hosted in rocks. And the province has also potential for calcium and lithium hosted in brines. So what could brine-hosted minerals extraction look like? Next slide. Brine-hosted minerals are extracted similar to how we recover oil and gas from reservoirs, but they could be processed differently when they come to the surface. For example, current lithium extraction for calcium chloride consists of a well site facility, and trucks moving brine to an upgrading facility. or these operations could look like a well, like the one in the photo, with a modular type of facility. Other alternative is a larger brine extraction operation that may consist of one or more multi-well pads and underground pipelines to transport the brine to the main facility. Here, mineral separation from the brine will occur, and one or more injection wells will return mineral void water to the original reservoir. There's a lot of interest in lithium, so I would like to speak to that now. Lithium potential in Alberta. You may not know that lithium can be hosted in brines, and in Alberta, those brines naturally occur deep underground. The Alberta Geological Survey has been investigating minerals in brines during the last 50 years. In the 1970s and 1980s, geoscientists with the AGS sampled underground mines and determined that many of them were locally enriched in calcium, magnesium, potassium, bromide, iodide, and lithium. The more recent demand for lithium to manufacture rechargeable batteries for electric cars and our personal electronics has triggered an interest in the world in finding new lithium resources. As a result, the AGS has been researching and publishing about these brines since 2010. The brines with the highest lithium concentration occur up to 3,600 meters deep in the subsurface under the plains from West Central Alberta to East Central Alberta, which is outlined in pink on the map. The minerals industry explored some lithium anomalies further and has outlined smaller areas highlighted in red with lithium resources that may be economically viable for extraction. Therefore, we don't expect the interest in lithium to end anytime soon. At this time, I would like to hand this back to Carol to speak about next steps for engagement. Carol?
Thank you, Gloria, and thank you to both Shauna and Cher for their presentations. Before I jump back into providing information about engagement, I just wanted to remind people about the methods for asking questions. Some of you would have signed up or entered, let's say, the seminar after I gave opening remarks. I noticed there is a hand up in the participant list, and due to the great numbers of people that we have on the call, we are unable to take questions verbally. So we will not be responding to the hands up feature. And as you will have seen, all the mics are muted. So I would ask that you redirect your question in two ways. One is either using the Q&A icon that's at the top right of the screen. And if you cannot access that, please email us your question. And we don't have it on the screen, but it's minerals@aer.ca. So minerals@aer.ca, and please email your question. So if the person that has the hand up, I think Matt Munson, if you could send us your question, that would be really super. Okay. So next slide, please, Jessica. As I mentioned earlier, this information session is the first phase in the AER's engagement approach for brine-hosted minerals. Our intent with Let's Talk Minerals is to both share and gather information to inform regulatory development. Beyond this session, there are 3 more ways for you to participate, and I'll describe those for you now. The first is the post-session survey. Directly following this session, you'll receive a survey by email to provide your feedback on this event and also on topics of interest and concern to you and additional information needs that you may have. I can see right now looking at the screen that there's a typo on that, May 18th. So please submit responses by May 16th, as we will use your input to help plan the upcoming seminars or the upcoming workshops. As an alternative to filling out the survey that you get through email, on the very last holding slide of this presentation, you will see a QR code on your screen, and you can just hold up your cell phone camera to access a link that will take you directly to the survey. So whatever you prefer. The second engagement opportunity is the engagement workshops. The 3 engagement workshops will support more focused discussion on key topics related to brine-hosted minerals, with the aim of gathering input for the AER to consider in the development of the regulatory framework, as Cher has described. Each workshop will target a specific audience to allow for open discussion as is appropriate for each of their unique expectations and needs. So the May 31st workshop is focused on Indigenous communities across the province. June 1st is the date for industry and industry associations. And June 2nd is for a range of stakeholders, including municipalities, landowners and users, environmental groups, and other non-government organizations and other people who wish to attend. An email notice about the workshops will be sent to you following this session. The third point to mention is our public comment period for brine-hosted minerals. You'll have an opportunity to review and provide feedback on the draft directive for brine-hosted minerals in the summer of 2022. And we will notify you about the public comment period when we have the date and the timing for it, and notice will also be posted on the AER website. And then just to reiterate what Shauna said about accepting applications in our timeline, the AER is aiming to be able to accept applications for brine-hosted mineral projects early in 2023. When we know more about the expected timing for rock-hosted minerals, we will respond and engage in a manner that's consistent to what we're doing with brine-hosted. To conclude this part of the information session, I'd like to emphasize that the AER is open to and encourages your feedback on an ongoing basis. If you have further information to share or questions to ask, please contact us through any of these means. Visit the AER website. The minerals page will be updated as we have new information, and there's an opportunity for you to subscribe to AER updates. Use the minerals email if you require more information or to send specific questions and feedback or advice. And all of that is welcome at any time. Call the AER's inquiry line. Our staff can provide assistance and direct you to the right resources on a variety of topics. And now we've come to the question period. So for the rest of the session, the floor will be open to your questions and we will receive those in writing. Before I pass you over to my colleague to begin that, I wanted to just share a few guidelines for the question period. I would ask that you please just ask one question at a time rather than multiple questions, and know that if we receive questions that are similar, they may be grouped and handed to the presenters that way. Due to the limited time, not all questions may be answered within this session, and questions we cannot answer here will receive written responses and also will help to inform our future website updates. And lastly, in writing your question, please be respectful of everyone participating in the session and the many perspectives that they bring. I'll now pass you to Chris Menzies, an engagement specialist at the AER, who will provide you with further instructions and take over to moderate the Q&A session. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you everyone for participating today. We're really excited for your questions and for the feedback that we hope to provide you today. Want to send a special thanks to all of the Albertans who submitted questions to us in advance. We received a question from an Indigenous community, a landowner, an environmental non-governmental organization, as well as industry. If you may recall, when you registered, we sent some information in advance with instructions about how to ask questions. And so I'd like to just direct your attention to the screen. You'll see on your screen, if you're using the Microsoft Teams app, that there'll be a little icon with a Q&A. It looks like a little chat bubble with a question in it. I would encourage you to click on that app, and when the bubble pops up on the right-hand side of your screen, or if you're using your mobile device in the middle of your screen, you can type your question in there, submit it, and we'll make sure that we get an answer for your question. Again, if you're using the web browser, which is great, we also are accepting questions through minerals@aer.ca. I will be cycling between questions that we received in advance, questions that we received through email, and questions that we receive in the chat box. And so with that, we would like to start our question period. We have a question that was pre-submitted earlier, and we'd like to start off by sharing this question for Shauna. The question is as follows. What do you mean when you say a full cycle regulator? Shauna?
Thanks, Chris. I'm glad you asked that. So a full life cycle regulator. Energy development projects, no matter what resources involved, have a life cycle consisting of 4 stages. So the first is initiation, and that includes some sort of an assessment and then an application review process, as well as things like statements of concern or hearings. The next stage is construction, and then operation, and then closure. And closure is a really important part of the life cycle, and it includes the project's end of life obligations. And that includes suspending production and removing equipment and properly abandoning and decommissioning the site, and then finally remediation and reclamation. We regulate activities at all of those stages to ensure safe, efficient, orderly, and environmentally responsible development. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. We've received a question through our minerals inbox from Karina. Karina asks a multi-stage question, so I'll read it slowly and maybe I read it a second time for clarity. So Karina asks, we are aware that the AER staffing is not sufficient to monitor oil and gas as it is. How will this be addressed if you're moving staff into mineral monitoring? Do you see this as an area of concern for monitoring or monitoring regulations, especially in remote rural areas? How will we be reassured that staffing levels will be sufficient? And if I may ask Shauna to address this question.
Thanks, Chris. That's another great question. What I can say is, with the expansion of our mandate, we're including new areas of resource development, and the government has recognized the need for AER to expand our resources. So we did receive additional funding to support the work that was separate from the oil and gas fees, and so we should be able to ensure that we're resourcing in accordance with the needs to ensure that safe, efficient, and orderly development. We've got over 80 years of experience regulating in energy and resource development, and AGS for even more than a century. So I think drawing on our existing expertise will help us respond as this starts to ramp up. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. Our next question was pre-submitted, and this question relates to concerns about environmental impacts as well as safety. And I'd like to ask Cher to respond to this question. The question was from Leach Farms, 1984, and is as follows. Due to there being a sour gas component to saltwater brines, what is the long-term plan for dealing with the sour gas? Cher?
That's a totally fair question. Regardless of how sour gas is produced, if it's produced in conjunction with a mineral or if it's produced as the primary target resource, we manage the risk the same. So we're going to have the same additional safety measures in place throughout the life cycle. So blowout preventers when you're drilling the well, if we know that it's a sour reservoir, additional setbacks, public notifications, and then through the life of the project, there's going to be additional emissions controls and monitoring and reporting. So when it comes to mitigating this risk, it's the same risk regardless of the activity. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cher. We have a question from our chat box with a technical angle, and so I'd like to ask Gloria to be prepared to respond. The question is from Eric. Is there an estimate on the volume of resources available? And can you provide a breakdown of those resources? Gloria?
Hi. I'm glad you asked that question. So it has two parts. So the volumes involved. The volumes involved could be variable, depends on the formation host to the brines. So it could go from, like, imagine a 10 meter by 10 meter by 10 meter, a cube of 10 meter cubics of water that is has salty and has lithium in it, and it goes from there to 10 times that volume or 100 times that volume of production per day. The volumes would be similar to the oil and gas industry, and the breakdown of those volumes, we just don't know because we don't have applications, but we do know about the activities by the exploration activity of the industry and the volumes they have calculated. And the breakdown of the volumes can be provided to you. We can see. I cannot reply to that at this moment because I don't remember the numbers, but we can circle back that to you and give you that information about the breakdowns. But remember that's related to exploration. We haven't received any applications, so we don't know for sure what are going to be those volumes.
Thank you so much, Gloria. We actually have a second question for you, Gloria, that was received in advance. Since the Mineral Resource Development Act was announced last year, we've received some questions from Albertans in informal ways about minerals. Some of the questions, they may relate to some things that you may be thinking about today. So we'd like to share those questions with you as well. And one of those questions that we received relates to what Gloria had just responded to. Are there current examples of operations within Alberta that manage brines at an industrial level? For example, wells or pipelines or facilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, we do have 3 operations in Alberta that manage brines at an industrial level. And one of them is near Colin Lake. Another one is near Slave Lake, and there's an additional one near Drumheller. So they manage small volumes, and they extract calcium chloride and magnesium that is used for de-icing and anti-freezing within the province and outside the province.
Well, thank you so much, Gloria. We have a question now from our minerals inbox from Alan and Bev. The question, it might be best suited for Shauna. And it goes as follows. The presentation shows AER claiming great expertise and reputation. The responses to the Coal Commission shows that a large portion of the population does not hold the Alberta Energy Regulator in a favorable light. How does the Alberta Energy Regulator propose to overcome this public perception that the AER is not a trustworthy regulator? Please note that this position may be strongly influenced by the recent court decision affirming that the AER is not responsible to protect the public interest. Shauna, may I share that question with you, please?
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the question. I think we've got a lot of great people working on this behind the scenes, and I think it's a new area, and we've got a lot of history we can draw from, and we can leverage our learnings, and we can approach this with a clean slate to get it right to start with. We've got over 80 years regulating oil and gas. We've got over a century at the AGS looking at and researching minerals in this province. I think we're all really excited to, it's not every day you get to build a new regulatory framework. And I think we're all part of this because we're excited about it. And I think the collaboration and this is the first step in making sure we're taking input from our stakeholders so we can have consideration for the concerns and consider your input as we proceed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shauna. We have a question that we received in advance from the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 5. And I'd like to call on Cher to be prepared to respond to this question as it deals with environmental matters. What does it mean if a spill were to happen? If an accident were to happen, either through the transportation of brines on public roads, for instance, or through infrastructure like well bores or pipelines that relates to corrosion. Cher, would you like to follow up with that question?
Sure thing. Totally fair concern. This is a space where we can pull from our experience. You know, we already have wells that carry brine. We already have pipelines that are piping brine. And when a release occurs, companies must report it to the AER immediately, and they need to start taking steps to contain the spill immediately. The AER sends inspectors out to the site to ensure those steps are being taken and just to provide additional oversight so that we know that the public and the environment is being protected. You know, those are the immediates. And then after that, companies need to come up with a plan for how the spill will be cleaned up and remediated so that they meet the government's soil and water quality requirements. And then throughout this process, the AER is going to be monitoring and working with the company and also interfacing with the public to make sure that those concerns are being met. You know, in terms of questions around corrosion protection on well bores and pipelines, you know, going back to what I said earlier, we already have wells and pipelines that are bringing these things to surface. And, you know, we have risk-informed materials requirements for the type of pipeline and the type of well you're drilling. So, you know, a company needs to come in and say what they want to put in that pipeline before we're going to approve it. And we need to make sure that they've got the right materials in place, but also the right leak detection programs, monitoring programs, reporting programs in place. So this is really a space where we can pull from what we already have.
Thank you very much, Cher. We actually have a technical question from Pierre in the chat about some of those standards that you were referring to, Cher. And this is a specific question about whether the AER plans to align with the National Instrument 43101. Then, for the benefit of members of our audience, the National Instrument is a standard of disclosure for mineral projects within Alberta. And may we also remind that if we don't have the answer for you at this specific moment, we will be sure to respond to you at a later time in writing. So may I ask Cher to respond to this question from Pierre, please.
You know, Pierre, that this is an area that isn't my expertise, so we'll probably have to take your information and get you, follow up with you afterwards to make sure we can actually get you the information that you need.
And thank you for your question, and thank you for your response, Cher. We received a question in advance, a series of questions in advance from the Alberta Wilderness Association. The Alberta Wilderness Association was kind enough to share their questions with us, as well as with Alberta Department of Energy. So because we received a number of questions and we want to make sure that everybody has an equitable chance to submit a question, we're going to be addressing questions as best as we can. Most of the questions that we receive from Alberta Wilderness Association are within the authority of Department of Energy, but there are some opportunities for overlap. And one of those areas is in relation to water. And so the Alberta Energy Regulation, Alberta Wilderness Association, forgive me, asked a question that I think Cher would be really good to respond to, and it's about water. The question is as follows. What are the water requirements for exploration and development of proposed mining? Are water requirements for freshwater. I may just take a quick moment to remind the audience that today we're talking about brine-hosted mineral development, but there is water requirements in brine-hosted mineral development, and so we would like to talk about those at this time. Cher?
Sure. I think one of the things when we talk about brine-hosted mineral operations, we need to kind of think about water a little bit differently in the sense that, the brine operations that we've seen are pumping really, really salty water to surface, taking out the mineral that they need, and then pumping less salty mineral back into the same reservoir. So there's not really a lot of water being taken out of the system per se at that point. What we've seen from our current operations that we have in the province and some of the conceptual designs that we've been looking at for the new technologies that are being contemplated for the process, again, they're just kind of stripping out that one little piece of the mineral and replacing the water back into the system. And then in terms of freshwater requirements, everything we've seen is not high freshwater demand.
Thank you so much, Cher. Just a friendly reminder to the members of the audience that we will be going into a deep dive into discussions about different types and methods of mineral development in the future, but we want to make sure that everyone knows that we're working towards that. We're just not quite there yet, so please stay tuned. So there was a follow-up question that Alberta Wilderness Association asked that's relevant to the question that Cher just responded. So maybe I just ask Cher to be prepared to respond to this question as well. The question is about waste products. So what is the waste product generated through activities, development activities? Is there an existing method for treating or recycling waste products? Or will it require new and different disposal methods?
So we don't have specific applications in front of us now, and usually waste products are going to vary really specific to the technology, the process, the location in the province that a project's in. So I can't really give any specifics on the waste streams, but what I could say is that we do have an existing waste management framework that it covers everything from handling, storage, and disposal. And again, this is risk-based. So we get operators to assess the physical, the chemical, and the toxicological characteristics of the waste stream, and then we classify it. And based on that risk classification, there's like 3 directives worth of requirements that apply that cover everything from how far a waste must be stored away from a different type of equipment, how wastes need to be labeled and identified, the spill prevention and the leak detection requirements that apply to the different waste streams. So the way that it works with recycling or bioremediation, depending on the class, is going to limit what can be put back into the environment. So, there's going to be some classes of waste that we would allow to be bioremediated or recycled, but there's going to be others that aren't, and they're going to need to either be disposed of in a landfill. And so right now, we haven't seen any proposals for new technologies for any kind of waste handling. So it would look, as far as we can tell, very similar to what we're seeing in oil and gas already. But what we're trying to do when we build this framework, because we do know that there's new technologies coming out, is we're trying to find a way to have that flexibility so we can effectively regulate new disposal technologies if they do come online, with the idea that we want to protect the public and the environment.
Thank you so much, Cher. Just wanted to say at this time that we are very grateful to have the support and availability of our partners in government available to speak to some questions as well. We have representatives from the Alberta Environment and Parks and also from the Department of Energy to talk about maybe some topics related to policy related to minerals. I see we've received a question in the Q&A that may relate to energy policy. And so I'd like to call on our colleague Ihong to be prepared to speak to this following question. What, if anything, are we doing to lobby the federal government to allow follow-through eligibility of lithium extraction from brine? And that question is from Greg. So Ihong, I invite you to unmute your mic, please, and welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Chris. This is Yihong Wen from Alberta Energy, and thank you for the question. The question is fairly high level, so I'll speak to how I interpret the questions. I understand the federal government has announced a couple incentive programs or tax incentive for mineral development as part of their budget 2022. And we recognize that there are some concerns about the eligibility of brine-hosted minerals for some of the tax incentive programs. We are working with our federal counterpart to see what is the rationale, what is the design behind it, and we've made the question or the concerns aware to them for sure. But it is the federal policy, the federal jurisdiction in terms of how they design and administer their tax incentive programs and etc. So it is falling under the federal jurisdiction, but we are actively working with our federal counterpart to raise the concerns that Alberta stakeholders have, and hope that they'll explore into that questions further and share some updates with us.
Thank you so much, Ihong, for your response, and thank you for the question. We've received a question from our minerals inbox, and the question is from Alan and Bev. This question is about location of resources, so I'll maybe ask Gloria to be prepared to respond. The question is as follows. Are there any potential brine-hosted minerals in the mountains or foothill areas of South Calgary down to Waterton?
Actually, there's no data for us to tell whether there's brine-hosted minerals in the mountains. We just know there are brine-hosted minerals under the plains from West Central Alberta to East Central Alberta. So basically, wherever you see an oil and gas well that provided us with access for sampling is the data we have. And the mountains are not there.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Thank you for the question as well. We have a question here from our chat box from John. How does the AER plan to protect the mineral brine resources under exploration or production from other operational contaminated waste? Is it possible that we ask, this question may have a couple of different layers. It sounds like there might be a discussion about rights and there might be a discussion about production. So if I may ask our colleague from the Department of Energy, Michael, to be prepared to answer, as well as we're happy to support the response. Michael, may I ask you to take this question, and please let me know if you'd like me to repeat it.
Okay, thanks. So this is Michael Morscat, Director of Coal and Mineral Development and Department of Energy. So at this point, from the tenure side, there's no, I think, active discussion on protecting rights versus one type of right versus another. We're really mainly focused on, updating how we administer those rights specific to those brine-hosted minerals. And as with other rights that we have, they, we'll have overlapping rights, and there will be sort of, some, I don't want to use the word competition, but multiple users on the landscape that will have interests and rights. So from that perspective, I think that's most of what I can say. Maybe I'll pass it over to somebody at the AER on the regulatory side to see if there's anything contemplated there. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. May I ask Cher to supplement Michael's response?
Sure. Really good question. I'll take this question from kind of two angles. First is, looking at I think you asked about disposal and maybe that intermingling with the mineral resource. So typically the formations that the AER allows like a waste disposal activity in, part of getting that scheme approval is being able to demonstrate that there's no migration out of that reservoir or that formation, excuse me. So typically we wouldn't expect to see anything coming out of that formation or any, other than what's being production out of that reservoir, if that makes sense. The other angle that I'll take this question from is, anytime you've got a subsurface activity, if you want to do anything underground, you need a scheme approval from the AR. And part of that process is you need to notify anybody else with a subsurface activity in the area of your proposed activity. So if you've got an oil and gas operation that wants to inject water for some reason and a mineral producer next door, they're going to have to notify that mineral producer and say, hey, this is what we plan to do. And those two operators have an opportunity to work out with each other if there is going to be any negative interaction. So there's a mechanism already in place for that.
Thank you so much, Cher. We received a question in advance related to consultation with Indigenous peoples from the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 5. And I'd like to call on Ihong to be prepared to help with the response. But I also want to share that we also received a similar question from the Alberta Wilderness Association that we'd like to tackle here. What's important to note is that while the Alberta Energy Regulator engages with Indigenous communities, consultation is not within the AER's jurisdiction. The AER, our Alberta Energy Regulator, does have a joint operating procedure with the Government of Alberta's Aboriginal Consultation Office. And so the question that was posed by the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 5 is, will Métis people be meaningfully consulted on proposed lithium projects in Alberta? If I may please ask Ihong to share about that question.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the question. Indigenous communities have been engaged throughout the development of the strategy, the legislation, and the regulations, including many one-on-one kind of engagement opportunities. So what we can share is that particularly with respect to the consultation requirements or detailed requirements, work is underway on the consultation requirements in the next phase of the implementation for the Mineral Resource Development Act. We could also highlight that the Mineral Resource Development Act is really an enabling legislation, and the details are being advanced in the implementation stage. Opportunities for further engagement, of course, are available, including the one that AER is holding today. And for sure, Indigenous perspectives are important to us to inform the implementation of the legislation. So like I said, work is still underway to kind of work out the detailed requirements for consultation. Stay tuned for future information.
Thank you, Ihong. We have a question here in the chat that may be a joint response between our colleagues at Alberta Environment and Parks and the AER. So before I read the question, I'd like to call on Amanda to introduce herself.
Sure, thanks, Chris. This is Amanda C. from Environment and Parks. I'm the Director of Policy Integration and supporting the effort working with my colleagues in the Department of Energy and the Alberta Energy Regulator.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Amanda. And I may ask Cher to be ready to respond to this question as well to support Amanda in her response. With respect to baseline environmental condition assessments, will the Alberta Energy Regulator or Alberta Environment and Parks be providing prescriptive requirements for environmental assessments for all projects? Or will it be up to the proponent to determine the necessary level of effort based on predicted impacts? I might read that question again just for everyone's benefit. With respect to the baseline environmental condition assessment, will the Alberta Energy Regulator and Alberta Environment and Parks be providing prescriptive requirements for environmental assessments for all proponents, or will it be up to the proponent to determine the necessary level of effort based on predicted impacts?
That's an interesting question, and I would say that that's really specific for where we are at the rate in the regulatory development process. So right now, we're kind of in this space of trying to figure out like what are our risks and what are the appropriate, what tools do we already have in our toolbox, and do those fit with these risks? Do we need to add additional mitigations? Do we need to maybe take some things that aren't appropriate out of the requirements? And that's sort of the stage we're at right now. So we don't really have any fully cooked requirements to speak to. So I think that that would be an excellent point to bring up in the workshops if you're planning to attend, so that we can kind of unpack what that would look like and how that might be a better fit for mineral resources if it is. I think that that's the best answer I can provide. Amanda, I don't know if there's anything additional you could add to that.
Sure, maybe the main thing or an additional thing I'd add in that conversation would be environmental assessments are really to help our decision makers, whether it be our regulators, make good decisions in the public interest about the impacts, and it relates to the impact that a proposed project may have on the environment. For now, and what we know from the analysis that we've taken is that mineral extraction from brine has similarities to oil and gas. And so we're basing some of our analysis from what we know of current regulatory frameworks and current experiences, and trying to figure out, does it make sense that it would apply to this new type of activity? What risks, similar to what Cher's mentioned, what risks are we overlooking or potentially omitting that we need to take into consideration, and how significant are those risks? When we look at an environmental assessment, and what becomes required or what is discretionary are usually informed by the severity and the complexity of that risk. Because this is a fairly new sort of sector of economic opportunity that we're looking at, some of that is going to be based on just our experiences, learning as we go with this. But for the time being, the AER and with the support of government will have the discretion to require some of those to require what is needed for environmental assessment as they receive and review applications that come in.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for the question. We have a question in the chat about regulatory framework, and I might ask Shauna to be prepared to respond. And the question is from Donna. Will introduction of a regulatory framework for brine-hosted minerals impact use of saline groundwater or downhole injection into saline aquifers?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Donna, for the question. I'm not sure that I completely got it, but the creation of the framework will address the use of the reservoirs that contain the brine. And I think as Cher was talking about earlier, looking at as we get applications in the future, looking at the circumstances around each of those and considering whether a proposal is in the public interest, weighing all of the risks, including the downhole considerations. And I think, like we said, it's kind of, we're still working on what those requirements would be. So I'd like to know more about your concerns, Donna, and I'm hopeful you'll be signing up for those workshops so we can understand more in the coming weeks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shauna. We received a question from Lithium Bank Resource Corporation in advance that deals with environmental issues as well as with mineral tenure. So if I may please ask Michael and Amanda to be prepared to respond to this question. The question is as follows. Will protected lands that are currently excluded from the metallic and industrial mineral permits be included in the new brine mineral tenure system? And some examples would be caribou, grizzly bear, or mountain goat habitat.
Okay, I can go first. It's Michael here. So I think you described a couple or two different types of restrictions there. One is, for example, caribou ranges, which is rights have been reserved, so we don't issue any new rights for minerals in those areas. And then restrictions such as wildlife habitat are not necessarily reserved from disposition, but have certain operating conditions put on them. And so at the moment, we're not looking at making any changes to to those restricted areas. In the future, we could potentially be taking a look at, if surface or no surface access can be issued with under those, or sorry, so if mineral rights can be issued under certain restricted areas without surface access. This is in some cases done with petroleum and natural gas rights, where say the metallic industrial mineral rights are completely reserved. We will in certain circumstances issue petroleum and natural gas rights, but with no surface access in those areas. And then likewise with the wildlife habitat restrictions, I wouldn't see any major changes to those, because those are really just warning the user of potential activity restrictions or access restrictions that would apply likely based on the activity that's being proposed. So those ones don't normally affect how we issue the mineral rights.
Thank you so much. Amanda, is there anything that you would like to say to supplement or support Michael's response?
No, Michael covered it pretty well. Any permits that would be issued would have to be consistent with regional plans, sub-regional plans, and conditions and requirements within species at risk recovery plans.
Thank you so much. We have a question here from the chat box from Pascal, and this question deals with current operators for oil and gas. So I might ask Cher to be prepared to respond to this question, which is as follows. Is there an expectation that there will be additional requirements for current oil and gas producers that generate brine water as part of their normal production operations?
Like you have hit like one of our topics that we're working through, really timely question. So we kind of think about that as co-production is what we call it. So we don't, once an oil and gas producer acquires the mineral right and then starts to produce that mineral for the purpose of selling it, we are looking at the minerals framework that we're developing to carve that out. So rather than regulating that under the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, we would cover those activities under this minerals framework that we're building right now, and trying to understand what the implications are around how we manage liability, how we account for the resource within that. That's all part of the process that we're trying to unpack right now. But the idea would not be that we would make changes within the oil and gas regulatory framework. Instead, we would put those changes into the minerals framework so that we're kind of managing the activity under the right enactment.
Thank you so much, Cher. We have a question from the chat box as well from Eric. And Eric asks, can the AER comment on the recent challenges that coal mining has faced in recent years? How will extractions of minerals, either through brine or mining, be any different? If I may ask Shauna to share her insight about this question, and maybe I'll read it out one more time for everybody's benefit. Can AER comment on recent challenges that coal mining has faced in recent years? How will extraction of minerals, either through brine or mining, be any different?
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the question. I can't really speculate on, say, future decisions, but I think in general, we've recognized the concerns that have been expressed by Albertans about mineable resources. And so while the brine-hosted minerals are not mineable, we are going to look more closely at some of those issues as we move through building this. And so I think what's loud in my head right now is, Gloria's comment that the brines are primarily found in central Alberta right now, and so I think that's a helpful context to keep in mind. And I think as we move into looking at a mineable resource framework, we're going to be able to have more information that can help us work through some of those concerns related to the coal side of things.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And just to reiterate a point that was made previously, we're early in the process, and we will have opportunities to talk about the other types of mineral extraction activities at some point down the road, and we'll be sure to inform the public about those opportunities. We have a question in the chat from Mike, and Mike asks, I would like to know what the government is doing to with the minerals portion of the AGS in the future, with the oil and gas industry not wanting to fund it. In a new mineral regime, there will be a need for a mineral division devoted to geology of these resources. So this question is about the Alberta Geological Survey, as well as about funding for that program. So if I may pass this question to Shauna and maybe Gloria to supplement.
Thanks, Chris. Really good question. I think historically we've seen there hasn't been a lot of funding for AGS in the past to look at some of these things, and I'd like to offer that I think it was in the budget announcement for this year that there's a significant amount of funding that's been identified to work on the public geoscience and to build this framework. So I'm really excited, and I don't want to speak for Gloria, I'll let her add, but I think it's really exciting to see the potential for some multi-year funding to help us better understand the public geoscience in this province, so we can learn more about what is in this province and what is the potential.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And I see that Ihong is prepared to support this response as well. So maybe we'll let Gloria respond if you'd like, and then Ihong, feel free to weigh in as well.
I'm happy to let Ihong respond to that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Chris. I just wanted to add to what Shauna already said. If you have a chance to look at the mineral strategy, increased public geoscience is one of the 6 key areas that the strategy has identified that the government needs to take some actions on. And of course, the Alberta government really recognized the importance of easily accessible and reliable public geoscience information for everybody to have access to, just to have, help the government, public, landowners, Indigenous, and everybody to have, an informed decision on the land use and the resource development. So the strategy has identified a number of actions under the increased public geoscience area, really to kind of enhance how we are going to go forward with a solid foundation for public geoscience and to support the regulatory system as well. So as Shauna mentioned, that public funding has been provided to AER and AGS starting last fiscal year in terms of, having some targeted mineral mapping work done and to continue support the public geoscience piece. So I cannot speak to how, in the longer term, how the governance of the structure will play out, but it's certainly under our radar to look into that and to ensure that we have a sustainable public geoscience support. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yihong. We have a question from Vince in the chat that is similar to the question that was just responded to. And the question is about providing public information about subsurface data and maybe some of the costs associated with that. So the question is as follows. So I might ask Shauna to be prepared to respond to this question. Currently, the AER does not provide freely accessible subsurface data unless fees are paid for data preparation. This is a barrier of entry to small startups and will slow the development of new energy resources such as brine-hosted minerals and geothermal, for example. So the question is as follows. Does the AER have plans to implement a more accessible system similar to what the BC Oil and Gas Conservation does, for example, or for example, the FTP process?
Thanks, Chris. Another great question. I might lean on Yihong again, actually. My sense is we're in discussions with the government right now to understand what our deliverables will be on the geoscience side of things. So I'm not sure that we have those details right now that we can outline for you, but I think you can look forward to seeing more information on our website as we have those answers. We'll make that available. Yihong, is there anything else you could add?
Not much, Shauna, but yeah, to your point, target mineral mapping work and public geoscience work is currently underway. So I understand the AGS AER has already starting to update the website to provide more accessible and reliable and updated information. So stay tuned for more information to come out from the current initiative and then future initiative as well on the information side.
Thank you so much for your responses. We have another question in the inbox related to the regulatory development or regulatory instruments. So I might call on Cher to be prepared to respond. How does the proposed regulatory environment surrounding brine production compare to other jurisdictions? Will this new regulatory system slow down or assist in accelerating development of these critical minerals?
Really good question, and you're kind of tying into one of our challenges is there's very few jurisdictions that have regulatory frameworks already in place to accommodate not only the types of mineral production that we already have in the province, but the types of technologies that we're anticipating. So, depending on when we release these requirements, AER could be one of the first jurisdictions. And so, if we're talking about something that's going to incent development or to streamline, getting these requirements out and setting expectations for industry and stakeholders for what to expect is probably going to advance that objective. When we look at the types of requirements that we're putting in place, we're trying to use as guiding principles like number one, protect the environment, protect the people of Alberta, act in the best interest of Alberta. But we're also not trying to introduce any undue regulatory burden. And so that kind of ties back to what I was saying when we say, part of our process has been looking at what we already do for oil and gas and seeing like, do we need to do more for minerals? Do we need to do the same thing for minerals? Or do we need to take some things that make sense in an oil and gas context, but might not make sense in a minerals context? So that's all part of our process that we're trying to develop the directive with.
Thank you so much, Cher. Thank you. And we would definitely encourage participants to consider signing up for the workshops at the end of the month and early June as well. And more information will be sent to you after the conclusion of this session. One question we have in the minerals inbox is related to development and across the distribution of potential development and the economic benefits that would be associated as it relates to mineral development. And so this might be a good question for Yihong to respond to. And the question is from Lisa. Will the provincial strategy include and promote development for all areas of the province, and not just what seems to be the hotbed areas that are already seeing development and jobs, for instance, the northwest corner of the province? Yihong, may I ask you to respond to that question, please?
Thank you, Chris. That is a great question. I would say, yeah, we are not, from the strategy perspective, we are not intended to prioritize one area over another. Our intent is really to provide clear policy and the regulatory system in place so that we can provide greater certainty and clarity to investors and stakeholders who are interested in investing to Alberta. So the strategy itself is really inclusive of all metallic industrial minerals and of all the areas across the province. We understand that our role is to, like I said, to really ensure that we have the effective and robust policy and regulatory system in place, and really rely on the industry to come to Alberta and to make the investment. So it's really a business decision in the end to, to sort out where to invest, what minerals to develop, right? So it's more than just the policy and the strategy that we have. So I'm looking forward to, industries and your perspectives as to, where it makes most sense to develop the resources and what are the resources that are making the top of the list for now. I understand lithium could be on the top of the list, but down the road in the future, right, the list could keep changing as well. So it's really hard to say which area we are focusing on. It's like I said, we are really trying to provide a policy, a regulatory system that works for the resource development.
Thank you so much, Yihong. We have a question about regulatory development in the chat, so I'd ask that Chair be prepared to respond. And the question is from Eric. Eric says, thanks very much for this session. These brine mineral offer a spectrum of potential value. How can we ensure that this framework remains flexible to novel concepts and technologies? An example of this would be ensuring that these regulations function efficiently and effectively with prospects for geothermal energy development. So Chair, may I ask you to respond to this question, please?
For sure. So I'm thinking about this question in two ways. And the first is, enabling multiple types of activities to occur on the same site, utilizing the same wellbore, so operators can kind of maximize the value of that single wellbore, of that single site. And so, we work closely with our counterparts that are working on the geothermal deployment, and we're testing with them, like, how does this work? Like, how do our proposed requirements kind of fit with what you're already doing, so that we've got alignment there. And then again, we're at the AR, so we're definitely making sure that these fit with our oil and gas requirements. And we're trying to streamline these, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that we don't have 3 layers of regulation on one site. We want to have the right regulation on the right activity within that site. So that's one of the things that we're really cognizant of and trying to test. The second part of your question that I think you're kind of alluding to is maybe like new technologies and new like trying to enable. And we've built experimental technologies right into the MRDA and throughout our regulatory framework. So what we're trying to do is find ways that companies can deploy a new technology, and the AER can enable that, or maybe not enable it, but we can regulate it in a way that doesn't require us to have a prescriptive set of requirements in advance. So how could an experimental technology come in, and the AER could apply the right level of oversight so that it can occur, knowing that more of our framework is a bit more prescriptive. So not all experimental technologies are there yet. And so, we've built that right into the framework.
Thank you so much, Chair. We have a question that we received through our minerals inbox from Kaylin. And the question is about meaningful Indigenous engagement. So I'd ask that Shauna be prepared to respond to this question, please. The question is, will there be any form of meaningful Indigenous engagement. The sessions that were had, there were questions unanswered and time ran out. Essentially, engagement was not meaningful. Also, are there opportunities to have one-on-one meetings with the AER?
Thanks for the question. I'm not sure which sessions were your concern is about, but I would say I think we've got one specific workshop planned in the coming weeks, and I think you know, based on your input, I'd like to be responsive to ensure we're having targeted conversations that are meaningful, and recognizing unique interests of all of our stakeholders, including the Indigenous communities. And so I think we'll be engaging as our work evolves. And so I'm hoping we can answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shauna. We have a question from Hillary in the chat about environmental footprint, and I would ask that Chair be prepared to respond to this question. The question is from Hillary, and Hillary asks, how will the AER, or the Alberta Energy Regulator, be involved in regulating the footprint created by exploration for brine-hosted minerals, including how that footprint adds to existing and future cumulative effects on the landscape? So I also may ask that our colleagues at Alberta Environment and Parks be prepared to speak to this question as well.
Thanks, Hillary. So, you know, in terms of brine exploration, we don't expect it to look like minerals exploration manifests on the landscape. So, you know, when you've got minerals, or sorry, mining exploration, you're talking about, you know, trying to delineate where this mine is going to be and where the resource is going to be. Brine mineral exploration is almost indistinguishable from what like brine production is, because you have to explore for the brine. You have to pump it to the surface just exactly the same as you would pump it to the surface to produce it on the other end. So we're thinking more like, you know, smaller single well pads on the landscape, not necessarily like large exploration programs. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. The AR doesn't put thresholds on the size of a well pad. We accommodate a well pad. You know, if you have to go deeper, the well pad has to be bigger because the drilling rig that you put on it goes deeper. And so, you know, it's just more strings need to go onto that. And so, you know, we really, based on the risks of the activity at the site, rather than looking at the regional level, that's more managed through regional plans.
I could jump in on that as well and add to Cher's comments.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thanks, Chris. As far as footprint management goes, like one of the other components of the Alberta Energy Regulator's regulatory review involves evaluating the site plans that come to them. And where beyond just the well pad itself, that sometimes it does involve elements of road or access and things like that. And so the application itself will take into consideration what that linear footprint could entail and what additional sort of requirements are needed to access that particular infrastructure. For the time being, we also know that whatever comes in and those applications that are received also need to be evaluated so that they're consistent with and they're still subject to the same land use planning and regional plan, sub-regional plan requirements that exist. That wouldn't be changing, and we're not making any exceptions for extracting minerals from brine. We are anticipating, as Cher kind of mentioned, that there may be a more significant linear footprint when it comes to hard rock mineral extraction, because just the nature of what that mineral extraction kind of involves. But brine is quite a bit different. The nature of brine extraction is a little bit different than what we would see with conventional quarrying or mines that you may be more familiar with.
Thank you so much, Amanda. If I may just say to everyone at this point that we're so grateful for your questions. We have about 15 minutes left in the question and answer period. And if we don't get to your question during the allotted time, we will respond to you at a future date in writing. So just wanted to share that with you. I have a question here in the chat box from Roy. And Roy asks, can you please elaborate on the AER, the Alberta Energy Regulator's government grant, such as how much, what was the amount, the length, the distribution of funds on overlapping tasks among other Government of Alberta departments, and insurance of mineral-related expenditures. So if I may ask Shauna to expand on the Alberta Energy Regulator's grant from the government, please.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Roy. That's a great question. I'll rely on Yihong to correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, and we can probably clarify in writing too if I'm a little bit vague. But we received I want to say about $25 million in the last year to undertake a lot of geoscience work, and to support the development of the regulatory framework. And we've got some very talented finance people that are working on processes to track every dollar that was received to make sure we know and can be accountable to the province on how that's being spent. And for the coming years, I believe it was about $40 million for the next 3 years. I don't know what the breakdown is to be able to tell you that now, but I think we can share what information we do have after the session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shauna. We have a question from in our minerals inbox from John, and the question is as follows. There was a comment that brine projects will not be approved until 2023. Can companies drill exploration wells into brine reservoirs before this timeline when the AER will be ready to approve projects to test the mineral concentration? If I may ask Shauna to respond to this question, please.
If you tell me one more time what the question was.
Absolutely. So the question was referring to the presentation earlier, we talked about how in the current timeline, projects for developing brine-hosted minerals would not be approved until 2023. However, in the interim, can companies drill exploration wells into brines before this timeline when the AER is ready to approve projects in order to test the mineral concentration?
Thanks, I appreciate that. I think within the presentation, there probably should have been a qualifier that we don't expect to be able to accept commercial scale applications until early into 2023. We do have brine wells in the province right now. We've got salt wells that are licensed under the AER, and those existing operations are jointly regulated. If there's a surface extraction type facility, processing facility, those are regulated by AEP. So the current framework exists and companies can be coming forward currently and getting approvals, and it's a collaborative effort across the departments to do that. So if somebody wanted to come in and drill some wells to explore quality of brines, they should engage us and have that conversation, and we can figure out, what is the extent of that project and have conversations with our GOA colleagues to ensure that we're dealing with all of the potential risks of that proposal. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shauna. We have a question here from the inbox, from the minerals inbox. And the question is from Lisa and is as follows. Will there be approval differences to industries who use or repurpose existing infrastructure rather than creating a new footprint? And I'd ask Cher to speak to this question.
Sure. So I guess There will be a difference on how these projects are approved because the AER is going to want to know a lot more upfront information about what's already at the site. So, we would probably ask for different information in the application, asking, to verify wellbore integrity, things of this nature. Are you going to, recomplete the well in a different formation? Or are you going to produce from the same formation, this type of thing? I don't know that we would put in a separate regulatory framework that was meant to incent that type of activity, because really our interest is mitigating risks rather than trying to kind of pick winners and losers in how we want industry to deploy.
Thank you so much, Chair. We have a question here that may require support from the Department of Energy as well as from our colleagues at Alberta Environment and Park and the AER. And the question relates to the application or regulation of projects under the Mines and Minerals Act. The question is from Roy. Roy states, previously, the Mines and Minerals Act was regulated by Alberta Energy and Alberta Environment and Parks. Now, the Mines and Minerals Act is regulated by the Alberta Energy Regulator, the Department of Energy, and Alberta Environment and Parks. How does this reduce legislation and create a one-stop regulation?
So I can give it a go, and others can join us to supplement any further information. That is a great question. So as you know, the government of Alberta introduced Bill 82, Mineral Resource Development Act, and the intent of that new legislation. Well, Bill 82 includes an introduction of a new legislation, which is called the Mineral Resource Development Act, as well as a number of consequential amendments to a list of existing legislation, including the REDA Pipelines Act, Natural Resource Conservation Board Act, and other legislation. So really, Bill 82 is to establish the mandate and the powers of AER to be the full life cycle one-stop regulator. And the amendments to other legislation is really to kind of integrate and streamline all the regulatory functions that are currently kind of shared across different departments and ministries to be the AER. So that's really the intent of the Bill 82 to empower AER with the authority to develop the necessary rules and directives to become the one-stop full life cycle regulator. The MMA or Alberta Energy is still primarily responsible for tenure to issue the tenure rights when it comes to mineral resources and the royalties, of course. But everything else will be housed within AER once the legislation comes into effect. And that also involves some of the transition of current regulatory functions that are with Alberta Environment Parks and the Natural Resource Conservation Board to be with the Alberta Energy Regulator. So that's really kind of the integration and streamlining of the regulatory functions, hopefully to provide more clarity and certainty and efficiency and effectiveness as well.
Thanks for the question, Merle. I'll add a little bit to what Yihong's already provided. You mentioned red tape in the question, and it's hard not to pick up on that comment. It's a bit counterintuitive in some sense that somehow by having more people involved on a piece of legislation, it might be potentially more efficient. This is one of those cases in which we think that might be where it might be possible. In the past, and you're correct, that Environment and Parks and the Department of Energy were jointly responsible for the Mines and Minerals Act. Largely, it's the Department of Energy's Act, and Environment and Parks is responsible for only Part 8 of it as it relates to exploration, partly because we care a lot about the impacts to the surface of the land when there's exploration that's going on. with the introduction of the Alberta Energy Regulator, there's an efficiency that's had by having one regulator that looks after both the resource conservation end of things and sort of the environmental impacts of that activity. And so you have some efficiencies by having, rather than going to two different departments, you have an efficiency by kind of going to one. And we think that introducing legislation and sort of building on that model for mineral development, it kind of moves that, kind of keeps that. It's a model that we're familiar with. There's a fairly strong relationship between our three organizations, and that has proven to work well in the past. That doesn't take away from the work that's needed to give the AER good clarity and good direction as to what policies and what outcomes we want to seek within as it relates to metallic and industrial mineral development or for other mineral development in the province.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Is there anything that you would like to supplement that question with, Shauna?
I want to thank both Yihong and Amanda for their comments. I think the only thing I would say is I think we're being really mindful of how these pieces of legislation work together, and we are wanting to make sure that we're leveraging what we can as best we can. And I think the Mineral Resource Development Act is a big step in that direction to make sure that we've got a framework that's practical and responsive and allows for innovation so that we can move forward as a province. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shauna. We have a question here for Cher, and this question was submitted in advance by the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 5. And the question is as follows. How will cross-contamination of subsurface aquifers be prevented?
This is another space where we're going to be pulling from what we're already doing. We already have wells that pass through multiple subsurface features. And so we have requirements for how those wells are cased, how those wells are perforated, and assurances for wellbore integrity. And those apply like throughout the life cycle. There's a certain way that you have to drill that well to make sure that that integrity is maintained. There's a certain way that you have to operate that well. And again, there's a certain way that you're going to have to suspend that well once you're done producing from it, and how you're going to have to abandon it. And I think we're going to leverage a similar set of requirements for our brine wells.
Thank you so much, Cher. So we have a follow-up question in the chat box from Pascal, and this is related to discussions about wastewater and production. Cher had mentioned previously that the new rules would apply if minerals were sold. However, brine generated by normal production operations is generally deemed to be a waste byproduct and not a sales product. Would these new requirements affect the type of production, whether it be oil and gas or brine? In other words, should oil and gas producers expect enhanced water management requirements to the current activities? And does that not go against the current red tape reduction that both the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Alberta government have mandated?
So, we're looking at leaving the oil and gas framework as is. What we're trying to do is build a mineral resource development framework that kind of works in partnership and in conjunction. So if an oil and gas operator just has a battery that's watered out and they're just putting their produced water in a tank and trucking it away, that's not going to be infringed on the mineral framework, or by the mineral framework, excuse me. But if that mineral operator, or sorry, that oil and gas operator has secured the right to that mineral and has the intention of selling that produced water, that's when we want to start managing it, because we want to conserve it. Once you truck it and you put it into, you re-inject it into a disposal well, provided that the nothing's been done to that produced water, it's just the whatever came off of your knockout. You know, if a mineral operator wants to come in and produce that later, and that's an option available, then we're fine with that. So, you know, we just want to have these pieces be able to work independently and in conjunction, and everything's, you know, based on, is it available for the mineral resource developer at a later date, is what I would answer that question to. But, you know, we are still in the process of working out how that's going to look.
Thank you so much, Cher. Just looking at the time, it looks like we have room for about one more question within this section of the presentation. So the question that I'm going to ask is from Guy, and it's from the chat box. And this question is for Shauna. The question that Guy asks is there a funding model for the Alberta Energy Regulator of brine-hosted minerals? Where will the funds come from?
Thanks, Guy. That's a great question. And I think given the dedicated grant funding, while we build and enhance the current framework for this, that is a question that remains. You know, is it application fees? Is it levies? What is it? And so there's recognition that that is a piece of work that still needs to be developed, and we need to answer some questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Thank you so much to all of our presenters for responding to the questions. For all of the Albertans who submitted questions, we're very grateful. They were very thoughtful. Again, if we were not able to reach your question in this period of time, we'll be sure to respond to you in writing. And at this time, I'd like to pass it back to Shauna.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. I just wanted to take an opportunity to sincerely thank all of you for participating in today's session. As previously indicated, we are in the very early stages of developing a regulatory framework for brine-hosted minerals. We're committed to working with Albertans to better understand what's important to you, and that as a regulator, we are held accountable for the decisions we make. We are looking forward to continuing the conversation in the workshops in just a couple weeks with the targeted groups. I'm going to encourage you to sign up if you heard anything today that you want to talk about further. That's the next opportunity you have. Those sessions will inform the future rules and directive before we gather additional public feedback on a draft directive through the public comment process that we have. And again, thank you so much for your participation. I'm going to hand it back to Carol, I think, to close out our session.
Thanks, Shauna. Yes, back to me to close. And before I close, I'm just going to put in one more plug around keeping an eye out for that survey email, or either using this QR code that you can see in front of you now. If you just kind of hover that phone over top of it, it'll show you the link, as kind of like we've all learned to do these days with restaurant menus. But one thing I'll say is the plug for the survey is it's not just how did we do here. It's very much about gathering more information from you. The questions are things like, where do you need more information? How might brine resource development impact you? What do you envision or anticipate for this industry? Like that's the kind of information we need to know. And we will be crafting the agendas and the topics for the engagement workshops based on your input, and also based on those big pieces of work, as Cher often described, that were those in progress pieces that we would like to have deeper conversations with you about to gather your ideas. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of your day.